What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I wanted to do a very detailed analysis and comparison of the sights in Black Ops 3. I get asked all the time why I use a particular sight on a particular gun or no sight at all on a particular gun, and today I wanted to share all of the statistical differences as well as the visual differences between all of these sights so you guys can make a more informed decision when you're creating your class. Let's get into it. Alright guys, so the first thing that I need to explain for this video is field of view. Now what field of view is, it's essentially how much you're zoomed in while aiming down sight with that gun. Now the base field of view when you're not aiming down sight for console is 65. Every weapon is different in the game, or every weapon class is different in the game when it comes to their field of view when you're aiming down sight, assuming you're not using a sight. So if you're just using the iron sights on a gun, for all the assault rifles, for instance, they all have a field of view of 50 when you're aiming down sight. For all of the SMGs, they have a field of view of 55, which means they're not zoomed in quite as far, because the lower the field of view, the more you're zoomed in. The higher the field of view, the more you're zoomed out. The big thing you need to know about field of view is the more you're zoomed in, the slower you turn in relation to what you're looking at. So if you're zoomed in really far, let's take the SVG for instance, which has the lowest base field of view at 18. When you're zoomed in like that, it takes you a very long time to do a full 360-degree turn on a 6 sensitivity, which is what I play on. Whereas if you take the MR6, which has quite a low field of view at 60, you can spin around quite quickly while you're still aiming down sight. What does this mean for our actual gameplay? This means that at longer ranges, it's typically better to have a lower field of view or be zoomed in more because it gives you more control over your target. As you can see here, I'm going back and forth between the shoulders of this mannequin and I have quite a bit of control with the sniper rifle. But when I switch to the pistol, which has that much lower field of view, it's much more difficult to keep that really precise movement from shoulder to shoulder. You see I'm overcompensating or undercompensating quite a bit, and I simply just have less control over my aim at that range. On the other end of the spectrum though, when you're getting right up close and personal with your enemies, you typically want that ability to move around quickly while you're aiming down sight and be able to track your target because they're typically moving faster in relation to you when they're right up close. So having a sniper rifle up close while you're fully aimed down sight is not a good thing if your enemy sidesteps you because you won't be able to keep on track with your target. Whereas with a pistol, you may be able to keep track of your target if he tries to sidestep, if he's more of a close quarters combat situation. So field of view is actually very important for our gameplay because if you have that lower field of view or you're zoomed in more, you typically want to be keeping your gunfights at a longer range. Whereas if you are playing more close quarters, you want to have that higher field of view so that you can track your targets easier. So how does this relate to the sights? Well, all of the sights actually impact your field of view. They change your field of view. And one thing that's important to note is that all of the guns are impacted in the exact same way for all of the sights. So even though they have different base field of views, an ELO sight on an SMG is going to give you the same field of view aiming down sight as an ELO sight on a sniper rifle. So let's have a look at the different fields of view in order with these particular sights from the highest field of view or the most zoomed out to the lowest field of view or the more zoomed in. So first up, we have the zoomed out Varick sight. This one gives you the highest field of view possible for a sight that you can actually select at 52. Keep in mind, it does have another field of view value if you zoom in, but we're going to cover that later because like I said, we're going in order here. Next, we have the Reflex and the ELO sight. These ones are actually tied at a 50 field of view. So they're identical field of view wise. I always thought the ELO sight wasn't zoomed in as far or had a higher field of view value than the Reflex sight. And I was completely wrong. It's identical as far as field of view goes. Moving on to the next one, we have the BOA at a 45 field of view. So you're slightly more zoomed in with the BOA compared to the ELO and Reflex. Then we have a thermal sight at a field of view of 41. Next, we have the Recon sight with a field of view of 35. And then finally, we have the zoomed in Varick sight at a field of view of 30. So the Varick sight actually handles both extremes. When you're zoomed out, it gives you the highest field of view. When you're zoomed in, it gives you the lowest field of view out of all of the selectable sights. So now that we've got field of view covered, now let's cover some statistical changes because some of these sights will actually change how your gun behaves as far as recoil and center speed and various other mechanics go. And some have no impact whatsoever, so we're going to have a look at which ones are stat changers which ones aren't, and we'll just look at a general comparison of several of these sites so you guys can make the best decision possible when building your classes. So first up, we have the classic debate of reflex versus elo. We now know that their fields of view are identical, and really the only two differences between these is, first off, with the reflex sight, you do have the ability to select a customized reticle. You can change your reticle up, you can change the color up and the shape and everything, and you can't change any of that with the elo sight. The second difference between these is simply how they look. The elo is generally regarded as a less obstructive sight because it doesn't have that entire frame around your lens. But there's also the argument that on the bottom side of the elo sight, it's a little bit narrower, and therefore it might obstruct a little bit more on the bottom side when you're looking at two targets that are standing next to each other, for instance. So this really just comes down to personal preference, and you can't make a wrong decision between the elo and the reflex. It's personal preference. Next up, we have the BOA, and this one, again, doesn't have any statistical changes to how your gun behaves. The only statistical difference it makes to how your gun handles is its field of view. Now, another thing to point out with the BOA is a nice little feature that it has that's just kind of separate. And this is, it illuminates red when an enemy is in frame, or blue when it's a friendly in frame. Now, in core game modes, I find this to be essentially useless, but if you are playing in hardcore, this can definitely be helpful just for that initial snap decision, because in hardcore modes, you do have to determine, is that a friendly or an enemy before you pull the trigger. And even though that typically happens very quickly anyways, because you can see teammates' name tags most of the time, it may be able to give you a little bit of assistance in that area. Next up, we have the thermal sight, and this one actually does have some stat changers. So first off, it doubles your idle speed. Now, what your idle speed is, first we have to explain what idle sway is, just in case you guys don't know. Now, idle sway is what happens when you're aiming down sight, and you'll notice here when I'm just got the iron sights on the KN-44, it's swaying all over the place. You can see it's not just holding steady on one particular spot, it's moving around like crazy. This is idle sway. Now, with this, we have idle amount and idle speed. Now, the amount is the actual magnitude of how much you're moving around. The speed is, as you might have guessed, the speed at which it moves around within that area. So with the thermal sight, this sway happens twice as fast, and therefore it's generally regarded as a negative thing because it's harder to compensate for something that's moving around so quickly. The second statistical change with the thermal sight is your center speed is actually reduced by 5%. What this means is it's actually making your gun slightly less accurate when you're firing, because center speed is the value that determines how fast your gun returns back to center after firing a shot and getting some recoil. So the thermal sight does make your gun slightly less accurate. One final thing to point out with the thermal sight that I have mentioned in the past is that when you're using a thermal sight, you get absolutely no target assist whatsoever when you're aiming down sight. This definitely makes this a much less viable sight compared to a lot of the other ones in the console version of the game. Moving on to the next sight, we have the recon sight, and I did a video already talking all about the advantages of using a recon sight, and there are some pretty amazing advantages that I'll just recap really quickly here. First off, your idle amount is reduced by 90% for all guns aside from sniper rifles. That's the exception. Sniper rifles don't get these advantages I'm going to mention when you use the recon sight. This is only for every other gun. So by having your idle amount reduced by 90%, that means when you're using the recon sight and you're aiming down sight, you'll notice here with the KN-44, which has quite a high idle amount compared to a lot of the other guns, even with that high idle amount, my sight isn't swaying all over the place. You can maybe see just a little tiny bit of movement, but it's still very easy to stay on target while aiming down sight. So that is the biggest advantage that the recon sight has, is its significantly reduced idle amount. Next, it also increases your center speed, and like I said before, it's better to have an increased center speed because it returns back to center faster after getting recoil. So it makes your gun slightly more accurate, and it almost eliminates idle sway, which is pretty incredible. So the recon sight has some great advantages, but the reason you don't see it used too often, the reason I don't use it too often, is simply due to the field of view. I don't like how far it forces you to zoom in, and for me, it's not as viable in close quarter situations as a lot of other sights, and that's why I choose not to use it on a lot of my classes. Now, I did mention that it's different for sniper rifles. It has completely different stat changers for sniper rifles, which makes sense because it would be ridiculous to have a sniper rifle with almost no idle sway on it. So with sniper rifles, the only stat changer it has aside from field of view is the center speed is actually reduced by 10%. So it makes it return to center slightly slower, which for sniper rifles usually isn't really a big deal, maybe for the Draken because it is a semi-auto. But for the other ones, you won't really notice it as much. Like your gun will kick up, and then you return back to center, and with most of the sniper rifles and the rate of fire that they have, it's not really a big deal because you're still getting returned back to center by the time you can fire your next shot. So the final sight is the Varick sight, which has no statistical differences aside from the field of view. It used to be able to give you long shots easier, and it used to screw up bloodthirsty metals, but both of those things have been fixed. So as it is right now, all the Varick sight does is it gives you a field of view of 30 when you're zoomed in, and a field of view of 52 when you're zoomed out. Nothing else changes. So there we have it. Those are all the different characteristics and stat changers for all of the sights that you can select in the game. I'd like to hear your opinion in the comment section below. What is your most used sight, or do you prefer the iron sights? For me personally, I prefer the iron sights on most guns, but every now and then I like to go into an ELO or a reflex sight. I don't typically branch out into the other sights very often. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.